For people who don't have a Pete, right? Because you're almost like a friend matchmaker in a work setting. For people who don't have a Pete, what are some tips and tricks to make new friends at work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on your organization, but particularly for larger companies where you have employee resource groups or affinity groups, I think that's like a wonderful starting point, because whether it's identity or interest or another sort of underlying element of your purpose, in a large corporation, there are going to be many opportunities to find people with just enough common ground that you have a very easy, low stakes, again, kind of collegiate sort of, we're all here, we're all part of the same company and even part of the same subgroup. I think the second thing for me is, having clear personal expectations about the degree to which you actually want some of these social interactions at work. So I know we've already sort of, established as common ground that organizations where people self-identify as having a best friend at work tend to report their organization as, so it's a desirable thing. At the same time, I think that something that the last few years has made acceptable, which I really welcome, is this idea that maybe work doesn't get all of me. And as a result, there can be some boundaries, like the types of friendships I want at work may be much more fundamentally professional in nature. And I don't think people should feel bad about that. Like if you don't have a whole crew at work, it's not where your social circles are. Like I've been the kind of person where I spend so much of my time and energy at work that it just has naturally come about that a lot of my social circle and a lot of my closest friends come from work. But there's a danger in me, particularly as I become more senior, in assuming that that's what everyone wants. And I think it's actually really important that organizations more broadly don't make that a core criteria. Like you shouldn't have to give all of yourself to be successful.
Yeah, that's become a slogan, hasn't it?
Totally.
Be your full self at work.
Or bring your whole self at work. But I think getting back to tips, it's, it is a bit of where are some of the pre-built communities that you can get connected to. Two is this idea of examining like what types of friendships and relationships would be meaningful to you, because then you can kind of figure out what your approach is going to be. And then actually, just because we anchored on that point, I think bring your whole self to work is a very easy slogan to have for, a culture of an organization. It's just not true. It's not true of any organization. Any organization, certainly, that I've been a part of or I've done work for. And that's because I think there's, again, very reasonable limits to what either an individual should feel obligated to bring to work. And I think that if we're being honest with ourselves, every organization itself sets what it believes are reasonable limits on how much of ourselves we can bring to work.
As long as you fall within here. We'll accept 3/4 of you as long as
there's
it falls within the
acceptable range. There's a big footnote on that. Exactly.
Big asterisk or multiple. Okay, so those are really great tips. I mean, I especially love the one about finding a community of people who share your interests, right? Because you already work in a similar industry. That's a great start. And if you can find somebody who has similar interests to you and obviously is located in the same city, boom, you just created the recipe for success. There's also, I think, a phenomenon of happy hours and lunch and learns and networking sessions. How do you feel about those more blanket sessions that attempt to introduce people to each other, but really they just kind of put you in a room, maybe with some alcohol and some food and some coffee and say, all right, we hope it works out. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they typically are very well intended. And overwhelmingly, I think that other than raw attendance, which you can derive with enough alcohol or benefits or perks, I think that many of them tend to not result in the more broadly desired outcome, which is creating those meaningful relationships. And I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I think one is, I think most people can kind of tell when something is a little bit forced or when it feels manufactured. And there's almost something, it feels very cringy, but there's almost something about like manufactured engagement that feels worse than actual disengagement. Because it's sort of...
Because now it's work.
Yeah.
Instead of
exactly.
chilling, now you're working.
I also think there's got to be some underlying sort of behavioral dynamics that govern this. But if I think about some of the work happy hours and social events that I think have sort of missed the mark, what I think tends to happen is you go to these events and then there's a whole bunch of people there, many of whom you don't know. And I think there's always some number of people in any organization or in society who are just so gregarious, so outgoing, so extroverted. Like you could drop them into a room with all strangers and they would just kind of manufacture connection.
Right.
But I think most of us, not just non-extroverts, but including many extroverts, ambiverts, and introverts, I think for many of us, you see that big room of people and your immediate instinct is like, I got to find the subset of these people that I actually vibe with.
Or who you know already.
Especially
Even
the
worse.
ones I know already.
Right.
And so it's self-defeating again, because now people have just kind of self-segregated into groups. So like you can either overcome that in a forced way by like manufacturing more, kind of heterogeneous interactions, which makes work feel more like speed dating. Or I think you can kind of examine the underlying question, which is, what are the types of events, engagement, what are the types of activities that actually foster things? And I think that brings us back to, if work creates the environment, creates the activities where people can find commonality of interest. So practical example, this Saturday, a group of our employee resource groups have banded together to create kind of a field day in Central Park. One of the activities is throwing pies at managing directors. So I'll be part of that. I'll be a target for that. And I think that I'm not saying that everybody's coming out for that. I don't think that's, I certainly hope that's not the chief motivator,
Okay.
But they haven't been like, hey, let's all get together on a Saturday and network. It's like, hey, there's a group of self-organizing employees who have decided what kind of games and things people will find enjoyable. And it's completely voluntary. And like, we're just going to figure out the fun from there. I think that will be quite successful.
Yeah. It is kind of difficult sometimes to take that step and go on a Saturday outside of the work week and invest in your workplace. But there are some great benefits to it. I think also, to talk about the happy hour point for a minute, I think the cold happy hour is like a happy hour before a talk, right? Those are always the hardest ones, because there's no way you're going to meet new people in 30 minutes. You're thinking about where am I going to get seated? You're probably a little bit hungry. You probably want to drink. You're probably trying to take in so much information. I don't think that works. I think it's very difficult to meet somebody new in that setting. But I think the happy hours, personally, very selfishly, that I've loved the most, come at the end of something difficult, where I've already been in situations, smaller group situations, and solved or accomplished something with a new group of people, where now we're going back into I'll call it the general population of the workplace. And I now have so much proximity to these new people, and they also have friends. And in that happy hour, I get to meet their new friends, and we have something very practical to talk about, which is the situation we just went through. I mean, I'm thinking about onboarding, different leadership development sessions that I've been part of. Even we've hosted some of these together back in the Soho days, but when people get promoted, right, taking them out and going out and speaking with them, and there's something to talk about. There's something very tangible that's happened, and there seems to be purpose behind the networking.
Totally agree. I mean, it's so interesting to think, I might even argue what you mentioned, challenging or difficult. I think that's actually a really important point, because I think sometimes those post-event networking are even better or more rewarding or fruitful when the experience, whether it was intended to be or not, is actually miserable. Like when there's a really lousy onboarding, or like, wow, this is like a super boring panel or talk. Like, it's the same reason why like why escape room like creates commonality, right? It's shared experience. And I think the greater intensity and uniqueness of the shared experience, positive or negative, is a big part of what creates kind of that initial fabric for people.
Yeah.